So if you do a search right now for anything related to Canon's RF mount and third-party options, you're going to get blown over with a tidal wave in the recent news that they've released right after Viltrox had tried to release some new RF lenses and was very swiftly pushed out of the way. Canon apparently released an official statement a lot of other YouTube channels have already talked about, where they're not allowing any third-party lens makers to make anything for the RF mount. And that's caused a lot of stir in people, and I find the timing of it a bit unfortunate because it seems like they've jacked the rates of a lot of the Canon brand RF mount lenses up significantly in the last few years. I looked at some of the EF L mount lenses, and while they weren't cheap, some of them could be had for like $1,700 or in that range, and the RF equivalents were $2,300, $2,500, some of them over $3,000. And so the timing of making all your products more expensive than ever and simultaneously saying, and any of the more affordable options that there might have been, gone, just seems like a bit of a cash grab. And for me, as someone who's been a hobby photographer for many years and in the last year decided to get really serious about it, decided to say, let's stop using APS-C cameras or point and shoots. Let's get like a real camera, learn as much as possible, take the best photos I can. The EOS R was my first foray into that. And as a brief aside, just to give you some context, because I imagine several of the people watching this might be in a similar boat, I had, up until this year, been using a Samsung NX30 that I bought used off of a friend 3 or 4 years ago. I owe that camera a lot in that it's where I learned all of the basics about manual exposure and how to do the exposure triangle and all of those types of things, and made a lot of mistakes with it and learned quite a bit. And I wanted to get out of what was arguably a dead system because Samsung was out of the game, and so I knew if you ever now need new batteries, new lenses, new anything, you can't get them. And so when I was deciding, it was sort of a pick at the time as I was saving up my money between going into Sony or going with Canon. I had used Canon cameras many times before over the years, so I had a little bit more brand familiarity, and I thought, all right, well, Canon's been in the game a million years. They're a stable company. As I'm switching out of a dead system, they make a lot of sense to go into because I'm not going to have any issues with them suddenly folding up and, not being able to find supplies and things like that. So it's a bit ironic when 3 or 4 months into my owning the EOS R, we get this announcement that there's now not going to be any third-party lenses available for the foreseeable future, maybe ever, depending on what they decide here. And yeah, you can adapt EF lenses, and I have, and I've gotten some good Sigma and Tamron lenses. In fact, my first prime that I ever used was a 35mm Tamron. Took great pictures on the EF mount, and it worked fine on the ESR, even with the adapter. And so it's cool, but over time I began to see it a little differently than I did when I first bought the EOS R. I went into it thinking, oh, the ability to adapt EF glass gives you all of these options, for all these lenses, and it does, but I ended up feeling like it was a bit of an obligation because save for a few of the more affordable RF lenses like the Nifty 50, a lot of the glass was pretty damn expensive, and so I often felt like I had to use older EF glass just to get myself some options that I could afford to really get into the hobby. And it's not a huge deal, but some of the lenses, especially with optical stabilization, are already kind of bulky and heavy, and when you're adding an inch onto them with an adapter and all that extra stuff, you just find yourself wishing there were more native lens options without having to use adapters. And I just found it unfortunate that I'm like, here I am spending all this money to get into a stable system that 5 seconds later, it already is doing something that vastly limits the lens options available to me. And I think the only people that I've observed so far that don't seem troubled by Canon's decision here are longtime photographers that already have a ton of glass and are of the opinion I would only ever buy Canon glass anyway, so this is irrelevant. And if that's you, kudos, that's great. But as people like even Tony Northrup have mentioned in recent videos on this topic, when they were getting their start as a professional, budget was limited, it was very helpful to them to be able to get some good quality Tamron or Sigma lenses at that time that still had excellent picture quality and were way more affordable. And as he lamented in one of his recent videos, looking back on his career, he basically said, I'm paraphrasing, if I were starting again and didn't have the option of the more affordable third-party lenses, I'm not sure that I would have really been able to get started. One simple example being the 24-70 lens, which is obviously one of the first lenses that probably ends up in a lot of people's bag. It's much more optically advanced than a kit lens. It's got a constant 2.8. The Canon RF version of it is like $2,400, I'm pretty sure. The alternatives, such as Tamron's extremely well-regarded 28-75, that's out for the E-mount right now for Sony, is like $800. And it's one of the best-selling lenses of all time. People have celebrated its image quality, and so you're certainly not making a huge sacrifice to go with a third party in terms of its features, its build quality, etc. Sigma also makes art lenses that are in that same focal range, also for about $1,100, less than half the cost of Canon's lens. And you start multiplying that difference out by how many lenses are you going to end up buying, especially if you're trying to go pro. That just makes a huge difference over time, so much so that I had some buyer's remorse, I suppose, when I first was hearing about that, because right after I bought the EOS R, I started reading the stories about the Rokinon Samyang 85mm that had come out briefly for RF mount and then suddenly disappeared, and nobody really knew why. And then the more recent story of Viltrox trying to come out with a really well-regarded 85mm, and that one suddenly vanished as well. And then it was revealed that Canon was suing everybody and threatening them for copyright infringement or whatever. And I suddenly started thinking to myself, did I make a mistake, like buying into the system? Like, as a camera, the EOS R is a very nice camera. It feels great in the hand. The ergonomics of it, Canon really nailed. Like, holding it, it was very obvious to me. Canon's obviously been doing this a zillion years. They know what goes into a good camera body, and they've just really demonstrated that. It's a great camera to shoot. I have no regrets about buying it in that regard. But anytime you buy a camera, you're buying into a system. And I could not help this feeling that, as fun as the camera itself was to shoot, I'm like, what sort of growth potential do I have now that basically I've got a small selection of fairly affordable consumer level lenses, and if I want to buy anything higher end, I'm now talking thousands of dollars every single time. I did the math one afternoon because I remembered, hey, when you were first looking at these cameras, you were also considering a Sony A7 III, and you opted last minute for the Canon. Maybe it's time to look again, just out of curiosity. I saw that the A7 IV had just come out. I priced it, did some math, and discovered, were I to invest in a Sony A7 IV, on one hand, it would be unfortunate to do that just a few months after getting the EOS R. But with how much more affordable a lot of the lens options are for Sony, because their system is very open and there are a ton of options, how much I could potentially save every lens that I get going forward, I would basically break even buying the Sony A7 IV, because it's essentially the same cost as, say, a 24-70 L series RF lens. And then after buying the Sony, the very first lens that I buy for it, I'm already now saving money, because I'm probably spending less than half what I would be spending with Canon on every single lens that I then build out for it. And, as I thought to myself, if I sell off some of my EF lenses that are still worth something, that could help me finance the transition. That was interesting to me, and I thought, okay, that's my plan longer term, but since I just bought the EOS R, that's not going to be something that I'm probably going to be able to do for a while. Some circumstances arose in the last month or so that allowed me to leverage some opportunities and get my hands on an A7 IV much more quickly than I thought I might. And so I have both cameras, but I am now in the Sony system. And for the foreseeable future, I think I'm going to be investing my money into building out that lens collection. Just as an example of what I was talking about, of the cost savings, already a month or less into having the A7 IV, I was able to get a Samyang 45mm f1.8 prime that I'd read a bunch of reviews on. Seemed people really liked its image quality, especially for the price. And the Sigma Contemporary 28-70 lens. I love how small and light it is compared to the art lens that I'd had before. And as two starter lenses, that gives me a pretty good variety of things that I can do as I continue to build out the lens collection. And most notably, even if I had paid full retail price for both, I had to have two lenses for still less than it would have cost me to get one of the L series Canon lenses that I had been looking at. And so already, I am not sorry to have switched systems, because it's just very clear to me going forward, the availability of the lenses for Sony just makes a lot more sense. And I'm not really making any concessions on the camera. Everything that I ever thought the EOS R did better than the A7 III, they basically fixed with the A7 IV. They deepened the grip on it so that it's more ergonomic. That was a complaint people had of the A7 III, solved on the 4. The A7 III did not have a flippy screen like the Canon EOS R did. They fixed that on the A7 IV. It's perhaps not quite as high resolution as the EOS R's viewfinder, but it's certainly workable. The build quality of the camera seems great. It takes excellent pictures. Just last night I was out in downtown in the nighttime taking some evening shots. It did a good job on those. And so I feel like I'm sacrificing nothing, essentially, to have switched systems. And I have everything to gain at this point because, like I said, already I'm saving money on lenses. And as someone who, doing YouTube, doing other client-related things that tack on nicely to the business I already have to allow myself to kind of dip a professional foot into photography, this just makes a heck of a lot more sense for the money going into it than doubling down and staying with Canon, to say nothing of how it's caused me to feel about Canon as a company. I am somewhat of a person that, while I understand all companies are out there to make money and inevitably they all make some decisions that people may not agree with, you have to some degree, I believe anyway, be okay with support, feel good about the direction that a company you're going to invest a lot of your money into is going. And when you look at Sony, who from the onset of their mirrorless system had an open mount, they licensed their stuff to all of the third parties. It just is smart. They get a cut of the action. When Tamron released the 28-75 lens, which, as I've heard repeatedly, is one of the best-selling lenses of all time, do you think Sony was that worried about it being competition? Well, no, because they were getting a cut of that. And so they're probably like, go for it. Sell, as much as you can. And then it also pressured them to make their own version of the 24-70, 28-70 lens better. The entire mount was better for it. And that kind of open-mindedness as a design versus a company that just seems very all about, I want as much money as possible from the gear I'm selling you. I'm locking out any alternatives. It just comes off as weak, to be honest, because to me it comes off sort of like Canon both is greedy, but also maybe doesn't feel like they could hack it against some of the competition. Like, it's understood that companies like Tamron have released excellent lenses at far cheaper prices, and they're just not willing to make less money on their lenses. And so their only solution to it is delete everybody else from the space. And that's a really risky move when it's just recently announced that even Nikon has now made a deal with Tamron to start making lenses for their new Z mount. Then you look at Canon and say, if you thought you were making some decision that the industry was going to follow you on, you're mistaken, because as it stands right now, you're the only manufacturer doing this. all of your competition is now working with third parties and increasing the options. And I know that I am not the only one who has been inclined to jump systems. Certainly, if you're somebody who's used a Canon camera for a whole bunch of years and we're already considering making a switch, this is maybe an easier decision. So anyway, I just wanted to throw my 2 cents on the issue, share a little news about the direction of my gear as I'm going here, getting more into photography, and see if anybody else who's maybe in a similar boat finds this helpful. Ask me questions in the comments. I'd be happy to answer some of them, especially as far as the switch goes. And I will be making more videos about the comparison I have to the EOS R and the A7IV going forward, from a more hands-on level than just sort of high level like this. But this seems like a really maybe short-sighted but definitely risky move on Canon's part to do this, and one that just disappoints me as a company that I have used in various ways for years as a hobbyist and just don't really feel inclined to be a part of anymore. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.